Well, thank you so much for offering your time, Donald. I mean, I've heard your name again and again and again, and I've read a lot of your research, and you've written books, you've written papers, you've got grants, you've done like amazing high-profile cases like OJ trial. Of course, some of the research you published into domestic and partner violence has been particularly controversial, unfortunately. So I guess starting with the big question first, what don't people know about family violence?
They don't know anything about female violence. They seem to think it's inconsequential. They seem to think it's not serious. Nobody gets hurt. It's common everyday violence. And that's simply not true. I mean, if you look at the statistics, first of all, on incidents, women actually commit domestic violence more frequently than men do. And secondly, men get hurt almost as much as women, physically, almost as much. And psychologically, they get hurt just as much. There's a long-term, huge sample study by Ann Coker in the U.S. that shows that men who've been abused suffer from depression and suffer from anxiety. They, in many cases, suffer from PTSD, same as women. So, it's just this whole stereotype that men are somehow invulnerable and they should be able to control her because they're bigger than she is. But yeah, a lot of men are taught not to hit back, so they don't. And it's not just the physical violence, of course, that goes on, but it's the physical violence accompanied by psychological abuse. So the whole idea, the whole notion of female aggression is something that people just don't get.
I always hear different levels of a sort of acceptance. Some people might accept that they're equal rates, but then they'll be like, well, it doesn't harm men quite as much. Or maybe I often hear women are doing it in self-defense. Like, what are the myths?
Well, they're all myths, and they were all in line of what I call the gender paradigm.
You've just said it there, the gender paradigm. By that, I mean gendered violence or patriarchal violence. But you've also described that as an ecological fallacy. So what led you to call it that?
Well, first of all, let me just say what it is. It's, the initial explanation for wife assault, and that was the only thing that was focused on those days, was wife assault, not husband assault, not domestic violence, was that men did it because they lived in a patriarchal society, so it was systemic. Social attitudes actually supported it, and women were the only victims. The data just show that that's just not true, that women commit domestic violence as much as men do, that there's virtually no normative acceptance of domestic violence for either gender. I mean, there was a huge survey done in the U.S. Only 2% of men said it was okay for a man to hit his wife to keep her in line, and 1.8% of women. So there's zero acceptance for doing it. And it was only slightly higher for women hitting men. So it's not something that's normatively accepted at all. And the evidence is just completely against it. First of all, the incidence data, 5 giant surveys done in the U.S. with a grand total sample of over 25,000 people, find the most common form of domestic violence is bilateral violence, matched for level of severity by both the man and the woman. That's about 50% of all reported domestic violence. 35% is female perpetrated, and 15% is male perpetrated. Now, of that 15%, only 5% are male perpetrated by the kind of things that could injure the woman. In other words, what's called severe domestic violence. These things are measured using something called the conflict tactic scale, which is a much better way of measuring domestic violence. It asks people, how do you respond to conflict in your family? What it does is it gets people to list the things that are done. And then it generates 16 times more abusiveness than if you say to people, what crimes have been committed within your family? Because people, first of all, don't think of some of the things that they're doing or their wife is doing as abuse. And secondly, they don't think of them as being illegal. So crime filters really suppress the amount of reported domestic violence. And when you lift it off, you get this much higher level that's reported. So the conflict tactic scale is the best way of doing it. When we do that, then we find what I just said, that it's 50% female, male equal, 35% female, 15% male.
So you're talking about bilateral violence. I mean, I know what that is, and that's obviously where like arguing becomes shouting, and shouting becomes shoving, and shoving becomes slapping, and slapping, and it basically escalates and escalates. So can you explain to us what is bilateral violence?
People are having an argument and they start bad-mouthing each other, and each one wants to top the other one. You did it, no, you did it, and things get hotter and hotter and hotter, and it gets to the point where something physical happens. Usually it's maybe low-level, pushing, shoving, whatever. The other person fights back. So they get caught in what's called a kind of coercion trap. Each one's trying to coerce the other and doesn't want to give up themselves. There's a study that was done in Oregon. There was a longitudinal study. It was actually a youth survey of people in their late teens up to their into their late 20s. And they found that people engaged, a certain number of people engaged in this kind of bilateral violence a lot of the time. But when it did rise slightly above the normal level of violence, the police were called. And when the police were called, they arrested the man 85% of the time. Basically, what you have is couples that are known to be bilaterally violent because they've been reporting on this longitudinal survey every 3 or 4 months. So they're asked questions about substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and domestic violence, amongst other things. So the researchers know that it's a bilaterally violent couple. But when the police are called, they arrest the man 85% of the time in what's a dual arrest state, because police have the same stereotypes as the public have, that domestic violence is all male perpetrated, and the male's the bigger guy, and therefore he's the dangerous one, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how it plays out. And then, of course, what happens is you get the serpent eating its tail, because feminist activists will say, well, we look at the police statistics and men are doing it way more than women are. Well, of course because men are the only ones who are getting arrested for it. I mean, men are less likely to call the police than women are, because for a couple of reasons. One of them being they don't get good service from the police. I did a case in Canada where a guy was stabbed in the belly. The police took him to the hospital to get the knife out and then arrested him. Yeah.
I mean, sorry to laugh, but that is I mean, I read that story before.
Yeah. And I had to check the facts of this case myself because I was writing it up to put in a national paper here. This happened like 15 years ago, but still, it shows you how extreme it can get.
So just to conclude on that, so there's a man who'd been abused by his wife to the point where he had a knife sticking out of him, quite literally.
Yes.
And then he was still arrested.
Yes, they took him to the hospital, they got the knife out, and then they arrested him.
Wow. I mean, that really brings me to my next questions, because everyone talks about this patriarchy and gendered violence, and people wave it away. It's just a semantic thing, but it's not just a semantic thing, because these political ideas are being used to train police officers. So how do these words like the patriarchy, how are they guiding the way in which police and the courts and services intervene?
Well, I mean, what you get is, the province where I live is very much into the gender paradigm. I mean, you can't talk to anybody in the provincial government here and get any motion whatsoever. Domestic violence is all male perpetrated. I'm doing a case here right now where a guy called the police on 5 separate occasions. His girlfriend was arrested each time, but they never proceeded with the charges. So they let her out every time. And then they get into a fight 4 months ago, and she bites him, and he punches her in the nose, breaks her nose, and they charge him. And so they're carrying through with the charges on him, but none of the prior charges on her ever got carried through.
And more broadly, what sort of support from services could a man facing abuse in Canada expect to find? Like shelters?
Very little. A good defense attorney is about all you're going to get. There's no shelter houses for men in Canada. There's one that was privately funded. The government doesn't fund any at all. He just funds shelter houses for women. So there's actually no government-funded support for men anywhere in Canada. Canada is probably the worst nation in the world in terms of the gender paradigm.
Wow. And of course, there was one for men, Earl Silverman's safe house.
And what happened to him? He committed suicide. He got so frustrated trying to get funding, and it just was impossible, and he gave up.
So Earl was a man who was abused by his wife. He could find no help, so he was like, I'm going to set up a shelter for men in my house.
That's right.
Funded it himself, got zero funding from the Canadian government, lost everything, lost his house, his shelter, and as you said, died by suicide.
Yeah, and even that wasn't enough to generate any change.
Apparently in his suicide letter, he actually wrote that maybe my death will create a need. Yeah. And it still hasn't. We're like 10 years on, and there's still nothing. This always just seems no common sense. I look at the research from yourself and Maurice Strauss, Richard Yellis and stuff like that, and I find it so compelling, the arguments you're making, and I just don't understand why are people so reluctant to believe in such overwhelming evidence?
Well, first of all, the left believes that domestic violence, they believe that the gender paradigm, because it's the protecting women who are the oppressed group and from who are the oppressors group. The right believes in the gender paradigm because it's family values. And so there's no resistance from either the left or the right.
The left are bought into the ideology of violence against women, and the right are bought into the ideology of family values. And neither of those see male victims of abuse, and then that's why they're they're failed by both sides in a sort of a.
That's right.
So what? I still don't know why though. Why like who is behind? I asked Erin Pitsey this question, like why are we in this position? And she just said one word, and she said money. So what do you say?
For Erin, by the way. I mean, I've met her on a couple occasions. She's very impressive.
Me too.
Yeah, that's certainly, I mean, she's right in a way. Now you've got a system in place where shelter houses are getting government handouts. People who are not particularly qualified as therapists are doing therapy on something called the Duluth model, which is really nothing. I've written about this, nothing more than brainwashing. It's just political brainwashing. People who are underqualified have high-paying positions because of government grants, and that goes on in Canada, and I'm sure it goes on in other places as well.
So, if domestic violence or partner violence truly is a men's problem, why do lesbian relationships have the highest rates of violence in them?
Because it's not a men's problem. It's a human problem. And you just hit on something that's very important. Yes, lesbian relationships have higher rates of domestic violence. In fact, there's one study that was done in Arizona where they asked women who'd been both a prior lesbian relationship and a prior heterosexual relationship with a man to report on violence and abuse in both, and they reported higher abuse in the lesbian relationship. And here you've got the woman actually acting as a control herself because she's reporting on two types of past relationships. No question that it's higher because it's a human problem. And in fact, the psychological factors that predict abusiveness, such as inability to control emotions very well and a whole variety of others, some cognitive and some thought pattern things, apply to both genders, and they apply to everybody. And at least in Western culture, they apply to everybody. We don't know as much about it in other cultures because, by and large, the research has been done in Western European, U.S., North American cultures.
And you talked about the research, but what happens to researchers that do actually talk about male victims of abuse in a way that Erin, of course, did?
Well, there's, Murray Strauss put up with it a lot. He got a lot of flack for being the first person to report the results of the conflict tactic surveys, which showed female violence as high a level or higher than male violence. And so he was given a research award at the American Sociological Association. And when he was given the award, the first two rows got up and walked out in protest. Here was a scientist reporting his data. I mean, terrible, right? That's what we're supposed to do. Now, there's a colleague, Denise Hines, who's at George Mason University in Virginia, and she's the first person that is focusing solely on male victims and doing really good research. And so far, so good. She hasn't been denied tenure or thrown out of the university or anything. So, and I, in fact, have a colleague across town here, Alexandra Lysova, who also does research on violence against males. So there's a second generation that is kind of carrying it off, but there's still a distinct minority, no question about it.
It's not uncommon from what I've read for such researchers, Murray Strauss included, to receive death threats for their work. Is that something you've also heard about?
Murray was accused of being a wife batterer and had to get a lawyer to step in and tell the woman who was saying these things it was slander. It was he was going to charge her unless she shut up. And I know Erin Pitsey got death threats. Just for having the audacity to write a book where she talked about interactive aspects of violence. She was way ahead of her time because that's it. 50% of all domestic violence is interactive. She was right, but she was ostracized and threatened by the political activists involved in domestic violence.
That's the thing that I always find most interesting, because these are world-leading experts, yourself included, Like Erin Pizzey opened the first refuge for abused women, wrote the first book on domestic violence.
Yes.
Murray Strauss quite literally founded the field of family violence itself, if I'm right.
That's right.
Susan Steinmetz, Richard Jealous, like world-leading experts, all of them researched male victims of abuse. All of them paid the price in many different ways. I mean, I read that someone once phoned a bomb threat into Susan Steinmetz's daughter's wedding.
Yes.
Like some outrageous things happening.
Yeah.
And it's like, who's doing that?
Activists, that try to remain anonymous, feel that they're fighting the good cause. I mean, we live in a world today where we see terrorism going on all over the place by people who feel their cause is just, or the end justifies whatever means that they want to use. So they just rationalize it that way, and that's been going on. That went on in domestic violence as well.
So, I mean, you talked a little bit about the conflict tactics scale by Murray Strauss.
Yeah.
This is really interesting how there's different ways in which you can measure violence. So how can you get different results by asking different questions about the same thing?
What happens is simply this, with if you ask people, this is a crime survey, and we want to know whether there's been any criminal abuse in your family. Almost everybody says no. And in fact, even if you say we want to know if there's been any abuse in your family, a lot of people still say no. But if you ask people what seems to be a really simple question, how do you resolve conflict in your family? And you order the techniques from light and rational. We talk about it. We try to get third party, and you gradually lead up to pushing and shoving, and then you get into hitting and kicking. And it's like 16 steps along the way. People are now reporting very specific acts. They might not think of these acts as abusive or criminal, but now they're reporting them. And so what happens, of course, is you've lifted the lid off this stuff. And that's why the report rates go from maybe 1 or 2% up to 16%.
So just to get that right, so there's two ways in which you can measure domestic violence, broadly speaking. The first is to ask questions like, have you been a victim of abuse? Has there been any criminal behavior? And the research finds people underreport because they're either reluctant to admit to it, or they just don't notice it at all themselves.
They don't define it as abuse.
Then the second way, the conflict tactics scale by Murray Strauss, if you ask people just benign questions about your relationship, like how do you solve an argument? How do you solve a problem? And then just give them answers without phrasing it in such a heated way, suddenly you find that men and women are perpetuating violence at an equal rate in relationships.
That's right. That's right.
And then that's the one that people hate.
And they dumped all over Murray Strauss for coming up with a better scale. What's a social scientist supposed to do?
I just feel like as an academic or researcher, you're just there to present the research. Like there shouldn't be any politics within it. It should just be an objective measure.
That's right.
And
Murray Strauss, to his credit, was a scientist through and through, and said, this is what the data say, and I'm going to come up with a better mousetrap, from a scientific perspective, not from a political perspective.
And another thing Murray Strauss is obviously very interested in, especially reducing, spanking children. So parents hitting children.
Yeah.
And what do you, I mean, obviously that's more his area, but what can you tell us about spanking kids, and does that lead to a higher prevalence of abuse later in life?
Yes. I mean, he did the research on that found spanking your kids made it more likely that they're going to be arrested for a violent act as adults. I mean, even though it works short term, and that's why a lot of people use it, but long term, it's not so good.
I've heard Murray Strauss describe spanking children as the most prevalent cause of domestic violence, and yet I've never seen a single campaign in a domestic violence context about reducing spanking. I would have thought if you've got the world's leading expert in domestic violence saying this is the most prevalent cause, spanking children, like surely domestic violence organizations will be jumping all over that with campaigns to stop parents.
No, because it's not. I mean, they just jump over what's politically correct for them, and they're not really interested in the science. I mean, the other thing that's kind of interesting is, this question of why female domestic violence is actually more prevalent than male domestic, is that in their teens, brothers who get into fights with their brothers are systematically punished by their parents, saying, don't do that, because parents maybe are more afraid of boy on boy violence. But girls who get into physical fights with their sisters are not similarly punished. So if you look at sibling violence rates throughout teen years, the boys' rates go down and the girls' rates don't go down. So girls actually come with this more about a sort of violent mindset if they've been getting in physical fights with their sisters than the boys do. And that's, one of the reasons why the female rates might be higher than male rates. I mean, males are also, despite what the gender paradigm says, males are also taught not to hit women. Even though the Marxist researchers say it's a systemic, patriarchy, and men use violence instrumentally to keep women down, the opposite is true. I mean, men don't believe in the use of violence, and overwhelming majority of men are taught not to hit women, and in fact don't.
That's one of the things that makes my head spin, because I'm always told that violence against women is normalized. I mean, I remember exactly that, told from a young age, never hit a woman.
The data clearly say that it's not normalized, and there's no normative acceptance. I mean, the study that Simon did on acceptance of domestic violence, 2% of men in the U.S. Think it's okay for a man to hit his wife to keep her in line. 2%. I mean, that's less than say they were abducted by aliens. I mean, that's about as low as you're ever going to get in any survey. So it's clearly not normalized. And I agree with you. Men are taught not to hit women. It's a no-no. It doesn't do that sort of thing. And in fact, some guys put up with horrific physical abuse because they won't fight back.
And that brings me on to another question, is that I've read even more controversial research where if you include men who die by suicide as a result of domestic abuse, the rates of deaths as a result of domestic abuse between men and women are the same. So obviously more women are killed by their partners, but if you add in those who die by suicide, they're actually equal as well.
Well, actually, it's kind of interesting. There's this research on what happens with relationship dissolution. Spousal homicide is a very rare event. Okay, like in Canada, you might get rates of about 7 per million couples. Okay, talking about a very rare event. Now the rates might go up higher to say 11 or 12 instead of 7. But here's what never got reported by the authors of that study: that men's suicide rates after relationship dissolution go up 20 times higher than spousal homicide rates. So the first target of relationship dissolution for a man is himself, way more frequently than his partner. His partner was politically correct, so that's the one that got all the attention. The suicide, hardly anybody knows the data at all on male suicides, but there's some studies done in the U.S. that show that they're 20 times higher. Now, the big question here is, why do men react so badly to relationship dissolution? They seem to take it harder than women do, to the point of acting out against themselves or their spouse. And we don't know the answer to that. We don't really know why the attachment issue. And attachment, by the way, goes back to John Bowlby, who a British psychiatrist who studied children during the Blitz in World War II, and came up with what is the most powerful motive in the human armamentum. It's not sex like Freud talked about. Freud was just caught up because he was living in a Victorian society. It's survival, and attachment is a survival motive. And it's very important, and reactions to attachment are incredibly powerful, including homicide and suicide. So we need to know more about attachment and less about Freud, who made up half his stuff anyway.
I mean, you bring up a good point. I've also noticed that whenever I try and present data from like the CDC, say on partner violence, someone always comes into my comments and says a woman's killed every 3 days or every 2 days by a partner, and I'm like, but you're positioning the argument at the very, very extreme. Like, that is true. There is a disparity there, but that is such a small percentage of all domestic violence, all partner violence.
Yeah.
So why? But in terms of just the middle, the more mundane partner violence, that is obviously a lot closer to parity. And actually, in some cases, women are more violent. Why are we so obsessed, though, with these highly, highly upsetting, traumatic stories of homicide?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. But I mean, the thing to keep in mind here is that spousal homicide rates are calculated per million couples. Domestic violence rates are calculated per 100 couples. So that tells you what the difference is in magnitude of these two events. I mean, also, the spousal homicide things make a political point. I mean, that's the way you sell this stuff. Somebody died, and people all react to that and start to assume it's normative. Well, of course, it's not. It's extremely rare.
Well, thankfully, one of the things that recently put male victims of abuse in the news, of course, was the Johnny Depp story.
Yeah.
I don't know if you follow any of that or have an opinion.
Ugh. I watched it and I thought, by the way, that I can't remember her name, but the expert that he called, I thought she was excellent. Oh, God, she was absolutely. I mean, I'm an expert witness myself. Okay, so and I do most of my work in U.S. courts. The main reason being that in the U.S., after there was an assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan back in the 90s, and they got so frustrated with the psychiatric response to the perpetrator that they called psychologists into court in the U.S. and Canada's been really slow to do that. So I was following. I watched her testimony, and she was absolutely first rate. And she, in fact, said that Depp's girlfriend, whose name like Amber Heard, is that right?
Mm.
Was borderline personality, and of course, borderline personality has been central to my work because I discovered that was the sort of essential feature of an abusive personality, the kind that Lenore Walker, as her subjects described or reported, they described their husbands going through a cycle of violence. Lenore Walker, though, never got into why that was. Like, she never got into the psychology of the perpetrators, and I did. And I found out that it was this borderline cycle that goes on where there's a buildup of tension that explodes in violence, and then the person's contrite and apologizes for it, and then does it all over again because it's part of their personality structure. And Amber Heard had that. And of course, the other thing about borderline personality is both males and females can have it. And Amber Heard definitely sounds like she had it, and Johnny Depp was on the receiving end.
You were an expert witness on the OJ trial in the prosecution.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how much of the Johnny Depp trial did you see, and what did you think? Like, just as an expert witness, how could you summarize her behavior and his behavior? Because both of them are saying that they were the victims
in Johnny Depp's case.
In Johnny Depp's case.
Yeah, I don't know that much. I mean, I assume that it was bilateral violence that went on there. I don't know much about him. I never heard her side get up with an expert and talk about what his personality was like. So I don't know. I mean, I just know about her. But I mean, it sounds like they were both, pretty volatile, to say the least. Yeah.
Probably the only trial bigger than Johnny Depp is the OJ one.
Yeah, and OJ, I mean, we were going down the domestic violence route in OJ, and what was happening is at the point where I was involved, they were having fact witnesses like her sister come on and testify about facts of OJ's abusiveness, and then I was supposed to come at the end and pull it all together and talk about the kind of personality he had and how that would make him more of a risk for spousal homicide. But as you probably recall, what happened was Johnny Cochran made the whole thing go sideways by accusing the LAPD of racism and planting the evidence. I mean, they had pretty solid evidence on him. They had her blood on his socks and on the dashboard of his car. So then they said Mark Furman, who was one of the investigating officers, had planted this stuff, and they came up with some strange interview that Furman had done where he was sounded like this racist rant. The strange thing was, I worked with Furman in that office for 2 months, and there were half the people in the office were African American. I never saw any sign of racism at all from Furman. So I just don't know how to make sense out of it. I don't, one theory was he was posturing to make a point to this woman. I just don't know. But the whole case went sideways at that point.
And as we know, he was acquitted, found innocent, which is just...
Yeah, they got him later for stealing his trophies back.
I mean, to go back to partner violence, if I were to Google partner violence right now, it will just be a waterfall of like a man with his fist like this, or maybe he's taking his belt off, or a woman with a man's hands around her neck. And like, why? How is that? What percentage of partner violence is summarized by that? Because that seems like 100% of the story from what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I can tell you, I got the exact numbers here. Really tiny. Everyone who reports intimate partner violence, who reports severe male intimate partner violence, i.e. wife battering, 5%.
So 5% of
all reported intimate partner violence is male severe.
If I were to draw a big pie chart of all partner violence, half of that pie chart straight away is bilateral violence.
That's right.
Of the remaining half, 70% of that is perpetrated by women.
That's right.
And then after that, 30% of that second half. So 15% overall.
Yes, and the 15% committed by males, 2/3 of that is just pushing and shoving. So it's not wife battering. So you get down to the things like hitting her or kicking her that could be wife battering, 5%.
So the most common form of partner violence, bilateral, followed by female perpetrated, followed then third place, bronze medal or male violence, and yet that's all we seem to see and hear about.
That's right.
It blows my mind.
Yeah. My mind's been blown for 40 years.
I mean, I always get annoyed at this. I get annoyed on your behalf because when I spoke to Erin, in my opinion, she's a national treasure. Like what she's done for women and men, saved more lives than you could possibly even comprehend.
Absolutely.
And like, she has not been given the credit she deserves.
Absolutely right.
And I would say you're in a similar boat where I feel like you have done incredible work in partner violence. And I don't think you've been given the credit you deserve because what you said is unpopular and albeit true.
Yeah.
But are you frustrated that you've been sort of criticized and not given the credit because of being honest?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I get no recognition in Canada whatsoever. I'm persona non grata. I'm surprised they still let me live in the country. I do get to do expert witness work still in the U.S., and usually I do cases where there's been a woman with a florid personality disorder and a guy who's put on the receiving end, and then he's been charged or he's got a struggle for custody of his kids, and et cetera, and he's got all the weight of the politically correct system bearing down on him. So I do cases like that, and I'm doing a couple right now. I actually am doing a case here in Vancouver. First time I've done a case in Vancouver in 30 years. This is the case I mentioned where the woman had been arrested 5 times and never charged, and then finally, he bops her and he gets charged. So we'll see how that plays out. It's happened to this guy twice in his life. I mean, he was abused by his father, and nothing happened. Finally, when he was 14, he struck back, and they put him in juvenile detention. And then he meets this woman who abuses him, and nothing happens. And then again, he strikes back, and now he's charged. So it's happened to him twice. And, he just fits the stereotype of what a wife abuser is like. He's got tattoos and a strange haircut. He's not highly educated, blah, 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 blah. But he also has only been violent twice in his life, and both times were in retaliation.
And arrested twice.
Yeah.
That is. Let's stick with the mindset of the male victim here.
Yeah.
We've already established that he picks up the phone and looks for shelter, and there are none in Canada. There's nowhere for him to go whatsoever.
That's right.
He picks up. He calls the police, and he's more likely to be arrested than his abuser. So he's not going to do that.
That's right.
He'll pick up a phone line. Maybe he'll call a service, and they'll treat him as an abuser.
That's right. In fact, Denise Hines did this very study. I mean, she found out that male victims of domestic violence, when they called an abuse service line, they were told that they were the real batterer 75% of the time, even though these guys have been beaten, scratched, cut, stabbed, et cetera, et cetera. That's exactly what happened to them. They get victimized twice, first by the woman and secondly by the system.
That's horrendous.
Yeah.
That is truly all. I mean, how eventually the truth will surely come out, and we're going to look back at this time and I hope it comes out. But how are people going to look back at these times when we allowed men to be abused and die with no help? Like how do you think the future would judge us today?
I don't know. I mean, I see an assault on truth, for example, just swirling around today. I mean, I see Donald Trump running for president in the U.S. and having about 50% of the popular vote, even though everybody knows he lies about everything all the time and demonstrates over and over and over. It doesn't seem to matter. So I have to, beat my head over that one. How can this possibly be true? The problem these days is with smartphones and the internet, everybody has a kind of knee-jerk response to something, and then they find social validation for their knee-jerk response online. So they have to really sort of dig into what the true statistics might say, because that's a lot of work. And here are all these guys agreeing with me, so I must be right. So, truth itself is kind of at risk these days. And I just don't know what the future holds in that respect. It's not looking good. I mean, there's been Aaron's work and my work and Marie Strauss's work. I mean, it just got overrun because the political forces were in place to say, we got to do this thing for women. And women, to their credit, brought it on. But I mean, the only problem I have with the women's movement is they weren't honest. I mean, they took notions of domestic violence and blew them all out of proportion and said that it was only just happening to women, and none of that was true. And I think some of the people who supported that stuff must have known better and were knowingly lying.
That's the thing I can't get. The people running these refuges, they must know better than anyone that the women that come into them are also violent. Well, they must know that.
I don't know what they know because they see women victims showing up all the time, and male victims just disappear in the ether. And so, women who work in women's shelters might actually believe that it's all male perpetrators if they never see a male victim, because male victims are allowed in their shelters.
But what I mean is that when Erin, for example, opened her first shelter, she polled the women, and she was like, these women are just as violent. So
she polled the women, and that's how she's different from most of the ones who run these other shelters.
Well, they don't. They just, what do? They don't ask questions they don't want the answer to.
I doubt it. I mean, there's been a tremendous effort to not ask about female violence. There was one study done of women in a shelter by Ernest Jariels in Texas, where he actually asked them about violence that their children witnessed, and he found that these women reported the children witnessing violence from them 2.5 times more frequently than they saw violence from the husband, even though this was a select group of women in a shelter. So, I mean, that was one of the very few studies that ever asked the question. But I mean, what you typically find are people not asking. I mean, the other thing is with injuries, there were numerous studies done in Canada at various hospitals about how many women were there because of domestic violence. Most of them never reached the light of day because the numbers were lower than anybody expected. There's only one study that I was able to find when I wrote Rethinking Domestic Violence in 2006. And that was a study that was done in Philadelphia, where they went into an emergency ward in Philadelphia and they asked the men, how did you get these injuries? And 13% got them through domestic violence. They cut the study off at midnight because they couldn't stay any later. They only had one researcher, and they said it would have been higher if they'd stayed past midnight. But I mean, that's the only study done on physical injuries to men, and there have been dozens of studies done on physical injuries to women.
So at least 13% of injuries in emergency room to men are in a relationship like domestic violence.
Sure, people, they stab, they throw boiling water. I mean, there's all kinds of bad things kind of.
I guess that's people look at relationship. Well, like, I'm 6'2". My girlfriend's like a foot shorter than me. And people would really struggle to understand how she could be violent towards me because I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I'm a man.
Well, it's not about size. It's about willingness to use the violence. And women simply feel freer about using it than men do. I mean, it's true that technically you could restrain her. Technically, I don't know whether you would restrain her or feel okay about that. And I've done a couple of cases in the U.S. where a guy restrained his wife and then was arrested.
Yeah, I mean, people that say, how could a woman abuse a man? I feel like they have a very low resolution, outdated view of violence that doesn't understand like the context in which it happens, and obviously a lot of psychological foreshadowing beforehand, and threats and accusations. I've heard so many men who are being abused, and their partner said, if you say anything, I'm going to accuse you of abuse. Even Amber Heard did it. Amber Heard is like, yeah, you call the police and see who they believe. You go to the courts and see who they believe, and she was right.
Yeah.
And one of the sticking with the controversial presentation actually I've seen you give, really, really interesting, that made the suggestion, the finding that as a country becomes more developed, rates of violence by women increases.
That's right. And in fact, it's one of your countrymen, John Archer, who was at University of Central Lancashire, did two of the most important studies in domestic violence. One was he did the first study that compared gender by incidence rates, male and female, and found that the female rates were much higher than anybody thought. He got all kinds of flack for that. But then he did this second study you're talking about, which was a cross-cultural study of domestic violence rates using whatever forms were used in that country. And he had a pretty ingenious way of sorting that out. And basically he found that as women's socioeconomic power increased in a country, violence towards women decreased, which is the good news. The bad news was violence by women increased. So the big issue is here, in other words, is not gender, it's power. And when women get to a point of having even just 3/4 of the socioeconomic power of men, they become more violent than men are. Now, that's one that twists everyone's mind, but there's the data, and John Archer provided it. And, he did this rather brilliant study on it. And, power is a big issue, and a number of people will be power when they get the opportunity.
Presumably, that's just an acknowledgement of women's autonomy. Like, the more autonomous a woman becomes, the more empowered a woman becomes. Like, naturally, a woman with autonomy, some of those women will use that autonomy to do things we don't like. Like, that is quite literally what autonomy is. Like, to do good or bad, that's her choice.
Yeah.
So it's kind of unsurprising that the more autonomous and free and empowered a woman becomes, the higher, the more the rates of violence by women would increase. One of the things I can't get over, because I work in the creative industry, and I often have to work with clients to help change people's minds on various different political issues. When I'm given like Murray Strauss meta-analysis of 200 papers that show gender parity in abuse, and he's summarized, and Murray Strauss, one of the greatest experts in the world, and he's got 200 papers saying gender parity in domestic violence, and I show people that, and it's not enough. It's never enough. And I'm like, well, then you show me your 200 papers then. And they never do. They never have a source. And if they do, it's awful. Yeah. So what do you think is happening on a human level that makes people feel so uncomfortable about simply acknowledging a woman is just as capable of anything a man is capable of?
Well, when I was a young psychologist growing up, people used to study attitude change like it was an easy thing to create. The truth is, it isn't. That what happens is, we lay down a kind of neural patterns, neural networks very early on that are formed by values and a lot of other things we do. And another one of your countrymen, Kathleen Taylor, who's a really excellent neuropsychologist, has looked at this. So in other words, people are a little bit like there's a legal concept called stare decisis, which means that once a judgment is rendered in court, then other judgments will rely on that judgment and they won't deviate from it unless the facts are wildly different. And, humans have a kind of personal version of stare decisis when they have this sort of developing notion of, who's powerful and who isn't, who's right, who's good, who's bad. And it's kind of like a snowballing thing that develops throughout their life. And then when you get political actors starting to enter in on this and telling them things that are consistent with what they might want to believe, they adhere to it. And that's it. They're glommed onto it. And you can give them evidence to the contrary, and that just gets dismissed. A number of social psychological studies that, show that happening, that people simply dismiss data that disconfirms their previously held beliefs.
I recently heard it described by Richard Reeves as a narrative violation. Yeah. And then you got to factor in the fact that people that step outside of that and do say, well, women can be violent and just as violent. They are paying a price.
That's right.
So you're risking like things you described earlier, like quite literally death threats and even like suicide. What happened to Elle Silverman?
That's right.
So I suppose it's sort of career suicide and actual suicide in some cases.
I remember I did a 2-day workshop in Spain, almost all women in the audience, maybe a couple of hundred of them. And they'd come from all over Latin America for this workshop. So I was talking about the patterns of abusiveness and psychology of abusiveness. And they were all very, very attentive to this. And then at one point I switched into incidence rates, which included violence by females, and I could just feel the audience totally turn off, just like someone had thrown a switch. They weren't with me anymore. So I kind of came back to what I had been talking about, which was male batterers and blah, blah. And then they all turned back on.
So what do you think the future looks like for male victims of abuse and this gender paradigm?
Well, I don't know. It's been tough coming. I mean, I think if you got some government that just said, okay, we're going to go with the data, and we're going to change things. We're not going to do these stupid Duluth things that don't work. we're going to really do a data informed. They would have to push it's a scientific basis and it's inclusive. They got to use that term inclusive. So I think they'd have to push those two things, and they'd have to really be convinced and stick to it. That might turn things around in that area. But I mean, it's so leveled. I mean, even right up to the United Nations has issued this edict on violence against women, where they just buy the gender paradigm, unquestioned. And so you got it from the UN all the way on down to the local level. It's like 5 different levels of support for the gender paradigm.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of what I'm seeing too. I mean, just to stick with where you are. I mean, I'm reading an article that actually mentions you, and they're talking about $300 million a year being spent in where you are, so British Columbia, Vancouver, and to build shelters. So the Canadian government signing off $300 million for transition shelters, for victims of abuse, and they are all for women, not one for men. So I mean, it's not particularly optimistic in Canada at the very least.
No, I mean Canada. I think Canada would be the last place to turn around. It's really embedded here. It's too bad. I mean, they're just running on urban myth here, and our current government's not going to change that around.
I mean, we recently helped fund the first shelter in Wales, so the UK, for men, and I would love for you to give a message to my friend Jody, who set up that shelter for men. Like, what could you give him any advice for male victims of abuse and how to help, or what you think he should be doing to support them?
Well, I mean, I think having a shelter, having a place where they can go and tell their story and actually be believed is 90% of the issue. I mean, I worked for 12 years doing court mandated therapy with men who'd been convicted of wife assault, right? And so I think the very first thing that we had to do with these men was sit down and have a lengthy conversation where we were able to convince them that we weren't judging them as a person, but here was this one aspect of their behavior we were going to help them change. And of course, a lot of these guys said, what about my wife? She does it too. And, all we could say at that point is that may be true, but we've only got you to work with. And so let's even give you some skills that would enable you to deal more effectively with how she acts. So, I mean, I think just the acceptance thing is huge, and all else sort of, trails out after that because these guys have been just systematically disbelieved up to the point of coming into contact with you.
I mean, I've read some testimony from some men who are getting shelter in Norway, because Norway is sort of doing some good work, and the words that are coming back from men that are finally being sheltered and believed is just so heartwarming and tragic. And they're exactly as you said, that they've never been listened to, they've never been believed, never been supported, and they are just so grateful for just a small amount of shelter. I really want to ask you one more, or 2 more questions, but one more just about this idea of everything is the patriarchy. All domestic violence and partner violence is the patriarchy. It's just one cause, and it's the supervillain of the world.
Patriarchy does not cause violence. I mean, and, there have been at least a dozen studies done of people who've committed abuse, asking them why they did it. And nobody ever said because of the patriarchy. I was reinforcing it. They said I was angry. She wouldn't listen. He wouldn't listen. I was trying to get his attention. But there were all these sort of really mundane psychological reasons that people give. It's not the patriarchy. And in fact, all the men that came into our treatment group in 12 years, I would say I could probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of them that really subscribed to a patriarchal model, said things like, well, women really deserve to be put in their place. And these are mainly guys who were European emigres who'd grown up in some more patriarchal culture and come to Canada. But nobody else at all believed. In fact, the other guys in the group would react to that and say, no, that's not right. So the fact that these guys were all misogynistic pigs, it's just flat out incorrect. They were guys who had emotional problems. They had a lot of problems in their life. One of them was they got violent once and they got arrested for it. It had nothing to do with patriarchy.
And I mean, I've read research where when power and control is a motivator, it's just as much of a motivator for women, violent women as well.
Yes, it is.
My last question then, Donald, I would just love to know, like, if you were put in a position of political power to make change with all of your wealth of knowledge and expertise and all your books and grants you've written, what would you do? Like, what sort of policy change would you do straight away to sort of help fix this problem?
Well, one thing that, we really need to pay more attention to, and feminists should be on side with this, we need to do something to make the first 2 years of a child's life as pleasant as possible, to assist the mother and the father in child rearing, because we know now that neural development increases exponentially during those first 2 years of life, and emotion regulation is dependent on that neural development. So we really need to do that, whatever it takes. If it takes having someone come around for family assistance or whatever, put the money up. It'll pay for itself in the long run. The second thing would be, if in fact there is an adult arrest made, I would focus way more on couples work. I would focus way more on using marital therapists and teaching people conflict resolution skills. And I think that would go much further than what currently is being done, which is unilaterally dealing with one person as though they were the only problem, when we know it's not true, and then throwing them back into a situation where the other half the unresolved problem still exists, and finding out it's ineffective. Well, of course it's ineffective.
Sounds good to me, and I mean, I'll definitely vote for that.
All right.
Don, thank you so much for your time. It's been so enlightening. How can we, just before we go, how can we find more of your work? How can we read your books and your website?
Well, my website, drdondutton.com. If you click on there, there's access to the books. The books are all available through amazon.com. So, it's not that hard to get them. That's the only thing I could think of. And anytime you want to talk to me in the future, just give a call.
I certainly will. Honestly, it's been so great, and thank you for your time.
All right.
Anyway, bye-bye.
Yeah.